We live in an age where clarity often feels like a curse. The more lucidly we see through illusions, the more meaningless the world can appear. This is the lucidity trap, the moment when awareness tips into paralysis, when truth seems to dissolve purpose. Yet there is a way out, not through blind faith nor through reckless extremes, but through moderation, the strength to balance lucidity with life, reason with passion, and freedom with responsibility. In this middle path lies the escape from nihilism. Lucidity, the state of seeing clearly, is often considered one of the highest virtues of philosophy and of life itself. To be lucid means to cut through illusions, to pierce the fog of comforting lies, and to stand face to face with the truth. Yet clarity is not always liberation. Sometimes it becomes its own kind of prison, and this is where what I call the lucidity trap begins. When the human mind looks too deeply into the bare structures of existence, it does not always find light, but emptiness. The philosopher or thinker who trains himself to strip away masks may come to see not the glowing core of meaning, but a hollow void where no inherent purpose exists. It is this excessive lucidity that becomes dangerous, for it is not ignorance that paralyzes the will, but the overabundance of vision. When a person realizes that all values are constructed, that morality shifts with cultures and centuries, that religions are stories, that political ideals are masks for deeper drives, and that the universe itself is indifferent to human hopes, clarity seems to have performed its task too well. The veils of illusion are gone, but nothing stands in their place. The world becomes transparent, and because it is transparent, it feels thin, fragile, unreal. Here lies the paradox. Lucidity that was meant to enlighten becomes the very force that generates despair. Instead of opening the way forward, it closes the will into stillness. One knows too much to believe, but not enough to create. This is what Nietzsche warned about when he described the danger of nihilism in modern man. It is not ignorance but awareness that corrodes from within. The mind that dissects meaning eventually finds nothing left on the table but bones. And then, when everything is stripped away, the temptation is to conclude that life itself is a cruel joke. The lucidity trap makes the intelligent man weaker than the ignorant one, because ignorance allows action, while excessive clarity freezes it. The ignorant man may march forward under the banner of faith or duty, but the lucid man hesitates, endlessly circling questions he cannot resolve. In daily life, this trap shows itself in subtle ways. The person who analyzes every social interaction until it becomes empty of warmth, the thinker who deconstructs every philosophy until it becomes incoherent, the dreamer who cannot act because he sees too many possible outcomes. Clarity here is not empowerment but exhaustion. It eats away at vitality because each decision seems absurd, each effort arbitrary, each goal fragile. To see clearly becomes to doubt constantly, and to doubt constantly is to drain the will of its strength. The irony is that lucidity was meant to protect us from illusions, to free us from manipulation, to sharpen our existence. But when it turns inward and begins to dismantle even the foundations of meaning itself, it becomes destructive. It is no longer a tool but a trap. The individual caught here cannot return to innocence, yet he cannot move beyond negation. He becomes a wanderer in the desert of thought, seeing everything and believing nothing. The deeper tragedy of the lucidity trap is that it disguises itself as progress. The person who falls into it often feels superior, thinking he has escaped the lies that others still live by. But his superiority is hollow, because while others may live within illusions, they still live, they still move, they still act. The overly lucid man merely watches, detached, paralyzed. His clarity costs him his vitality. This is the point where lucidity, which was supposed to illuminate, instead blinds. Nihilism does not always arrive as a sudden collapse of belief. It often emerges through the slow erosion caused by extremes. Human beings are rarely destroyed by balance, but almost always by the violent pull toward one pole or the other. When life is lived entirely in faith and the conviction that meaning is ready-made and guaranteed, the inevitable shattering of that illusion gives rise to despair. When life is lived in utter disbelief, in the embrace of chaos and emptiness, existence becomes intolerable because no horizon remains to guide action. In both cases, the individual is trapped by extremes that appear at first to offer strength, but eventually reveal themselves as prisons. The all-or-nothing mindset is particularly seductive. Many people are drawn to absolute systems because absolutes feel safe. A strict religion, a rigid ideology, or even an uncompromising personal philosophy promises certainty. There is no ambiguity to wrestle with, no shades of gray to endure. But this false stability conceals its fragility. As soon as doubt creeps in, as soon as the absolute shows a crack, the whole edifice collapses. A single question can undo decades of devotion. The believer who once lived in perfect faith is suddenly faced with nothing but dust. The fall from absolute belief to absolute despair is steep because the framework never allowed for moderation. It never permitted a gradual transition or a resilient adaptation. It was all or nothing, and when all is gone, only nothing remains. On the other side lies the extreme rejection of all meaning, the pure embrace of nihilism. This too is a trap because it refuses to acknowledge the subtle forms of value that arise in daily life. To say that nothing matters is as rigid and absolute as to say that everything is preordained. Both positions flatten the complexity of existence into a single formula. The nihilist may feel brave in his rejection of illusions, but in truth he has only chosen the opposite extreme of the believer. He is still caught within the same structure of all or nothing thinking. His clarity feels sharp, but it is sterile, unable to nourish life. Moderation, often misunderstood as weakness or compromise, is in fact the hidden strength that resists these extremes. To live moderately is not to dilute passion or ambition, but to resist the seduction of absolutes. It is to understand that life cannot be fully captured by a single belief system, nor can it be dismissed as entirely meaningless. Moderation allows one to hold contradictions without collapsing, to accept uncertainty without despair, and to create value without pretending it is eternal. It is precisely this flexibility that protects against nihilism. The reason moderation escapes the trap of extremes is because it avoids the sudden collapse. It does not promise eternal truth, so it is not shattered by doubt. It does not declare that nothing matters, so it does not sink into paralysis. Instead, it moves in the space between, where small meanings, shifting values, and temporary commitments are allowed to exist. This resilience prevents the violent oscillation between absolute faith and total despair. In moderation, a person can lose one belief without losing the capacity for belief itself, can question one value without surrendering to emptiness. Human beings are not made to live in absolutes. Our minds and hearts are too fluid, our world too complex, for rigid structures to hold forever. Extremes provide a sense of certainty, but at the cost of adaptability, and when they break completely. Moderation is the antidote because it is not brittle but elastic. It bends with the weight of doubt instead of snapping. It allows clarity without paralysis, faith without fanaticism, and freedom without chaos. In this way, moderation does not weaken life. It preserves it from the destructive cycle of extremes where nihilism breeds most fiercely. Moderation is often confused with mediocrity, as if to live moderately were to live without intensity, without conviction, without passion. Yet the truth is the opposite. Real moderation is not the denial of strength, but its refinement, the ability to balance forces that would otherwise tear a person apart. To live moderately is not to dilute life, but to harness it, to hold fire without letting it burn the hand, to walk the edge without falling into the abyss. This moderation is not bland compromise, but creative balance. And it is through this balance that the individual discovers the possibility of escaping the suffocating pull of nihilism. Extremes have the charm of simplicity. To surrender completely to desire feels intoxicating. To renounce completely in ascetic denial feels equally powerful. But both are acts of escape rather than creation. They free a person from the struggle of balance by choosing one pole and ignoring the other. Yet life is not lived in purity. It is lived in tension. There is always the tug between freedom and responsibility, passion and reason, individual desire and collective duty. Moderation does not erase these tensions but accepts them as the very condition of existence. It acknowledges that meaning is not found in choosing one side forever, but in living within the dynamic play between them. This balance is not static, but active. It requires vigilance, constant adjustment, and above all, creativity. The one who practices moderation must learn to weave together opposites, to shape harmony out of discord, to turn contradictions into energy rather than obstacles. This is why moderation is not weakness but strength, for it takes more courage to remain upright in the storm than to throw oneself fully to one direction. The extreme path is easier because it eliminates the burden of choice. The moderate path is harder because it requires choice every moment. In that difficulty lies its creative power. The connection to nihilism becomes clear here. Nihilism thrives on collapse, on the disintegration of values, on the inability to sustain tension. It whispers that if no absolute truth exists, then nothing is worth pursuing. But moderation answers differently. It does not demand absolute truth to justify living. It knows that partial truths, shifting meanings, and fragile values are still enough to sustain life if they are creatively balanced. To walk the middle path is to refuse both the illusion of permanence and the despair of emptiness. It is to say that even if nothing is eternal, something can still matter now, and that something can be shaped by choice. Creative balance also opens space for renewal. When one belief withers, moderation does not collapse into nihilism but adjusts, finding new ground without demanding that it last forever. This flexibility is a form of resilience that extremes cannot provide. The rigid believer, when shaken, falls apart. The rigid nihilist, when confronted with wonder, cannot respond. But the moderate individual can bend, shift, and rebuild, because his strength lies not in absolutes, but in balance itself. In this way, moderation allows meaning to be continuously created, even in the absence of ultimate foundations. To live in moderation is therefore to live as an artist rather than a soldier. The soldier follows orders absolutely, marching in one direction until the ground crumbles beneath him. The artist takes fragments, contradictions, and tensions, and transforms them into form, color, and expression. Moderation is this artistry of existence. It does not reduce life to uniformity. It makes life sustainable by turning tension into beauty, and in doing so, it escapes the void, not by denying it, but by weaving around it a fabric strong enough to carry the weight of being. Passive nihilism is the quiet surrender of the soul to emptiness. It is not the loud rebellion of those who declare that life has no meaning, but the softer, slower decay of will when a person continues to exist without fire, without direction, without belief in the value of action. It manifests not in grand philosophical statements, but in the daily erosion of vitality. One wakes, goes through routines, fulfills obligations, yet behind every gesture there is the unspoken thought that none of it ultimately matters. This is passive nihilism, a resignation to nothingness, not chosen consciously but accepted silently. What makes it dangerous is that it feels safe. Active nihilism is explosive, dramatic, even creative at times, as it destroys old values and demands new ones. Passive nihilism, on the other hand, asks for nothing. It numbs the spirit instead of challenging it, convinces the individual that the best response to a meaningless universe is to simply reduce one's expectations, avoid intensity, and settle into inertia. It appears harmless because it is quiet, but in its silence it drains the will to live. Instead of confronting the void, it accepts it as a permanent home, and this acceptance robs life of both tragedy and triumph. Moderate lucidity offers another path. To be lucid is to see the emptiness clearly, to recognize that the foundations of traditional meaning have collapsed. But lucidity alone, without balance, risks becoming paralyzing. The key lies in combining lucidity with moderation, the ability to acknowledge the void without dissolving into passivity. Moderation prevents clarity from hardening into despair by insisting that even though nothing is eternal, there is still value in the temporary, the fragile, the humanly created. It is the strength to look into the abyss without losing the capacity to step forward. Where passive nihilism says, "Nothing matters, so why bother?" moderate lucidity answers, "Nothing is given, but something can be made." This shift in attitude is subtle, but decisive. It turns nihilism into a challenge rather than a verdict. It rejects the temptation to let emptiness dictate the terms of existence, and instead transforms emptiness into space where new values, however provisional, can be shaped. By refusing to collapse into apathy, moderate lucidity becomes the ground of creativity. Passive nihilism is seductive because it spares the individual from responsibility. If nothing matters, then nothing needs to be done. No risks, no struggles, no sacrifices. But this very relief is the essence of its danger. To stop demanding meaning is to stop living fully. Moderate lucidity resists this temptation by reminding us that meaning does not have to be discovered as if it were buried treasure. It can be built. The lack of inherent purpose is not a reason for passivity, but an invitation to create. The balance of lucidity and moderation gives rise to resilience. Instead of breaking under the awareness of the void, the individual learns to endure it and move through it. This endurance is not a denial of nihilism, but a way of passing beyond it. It allows one to act with the knowledge that nothing is ultimate, and yet to act all the same. This is a life lived without illusions, but also without paralysis, where clarity does not kill vitality, but sharpens it. The escape from passive nihilism is not in returning to old certainties, nor in denying the absence of foundations. It is in standing within the emptiness and choosing to move, choosing to create, choosing to live. Moderate lucidity does not cure the void. It teaches how to carry it without being crushed, how to walk with it without being frozen in place. It transforms resignation into freedom by refusing to let nothingness dictate the end of action. To revalue values is not to destroy them outright, but to reshape the way we hold them. Traditional systems of morality often present themselves as eternal, fixed, unquestionable truths, and for centuries people lived under the assumption that their worth was secured by divine will or cosmic law. But once these foundations are stripped away, as Nietzsche observed, the meaning of those values begins to crumble. In the shadow of nihilism, one can either despair at this collapse or recognize it as an opening. Moderation provides the balance required to step into this opening without being consumed by it, for it allows values to remain meaningful even when their supposed absolutes have dissolved. When all values are seen as constructions rather than eternal truths, the temptation is to conclude that nothing has any worth at all. This is the collapse that nihilism celebrates. If nothing is absolute, then all is arbitrary. But this is not the only conclusion. If values are human-made, then they can be remade, adapted, and reshaped. They are no longer chains, but tools. Moderation is what allows a person to hold this insight without swinging into either extreme, without clinging desperately to outdated absolutes or abandoning all meaning in despair. It permits a middle space where one can say, these values are not eternal, but they are still valuable. They may not last forever, but they guide life here and now. This capacity to reshape values through moderation demands both humility and courage. Humility, because it requires accepting that no single system can claim ultimate authority, and courage, because it requires living without guarantees. To live moderately in this sense is to accept impermanence without surrendering to emptiness. It is to work with fragments rather than absolutes, to create meaning even while knowing it is provisional. In this creative act lies the genuine escape from nihilism. The destruction of old values does not have to lead to the void. It can instead lead to a workshop where new values are forged through experience, reflection, and dialogue. The power of moderation in this process is its resistance to rigidity. Absolute truths tend to shatter when confronted with doubt, and absolute denials tend to collapse when confronted with beauty, love, or wonder. But moderation is flexible. It does not claim that values are fixed, nor that they are worthless. It understands that value is not found in permanence but in relevance, not in cosmic guarantee but in lived significance. Thus, moderation transforms the supposed weakness of impermanence into a strength. If values can be reshaped, then they can be adapted to new conditions, renewed in different times, and reimagined by different generations. Revaluing values through moderation also requires the recognition that meaning is not something waiting to be uncovered, but something actively created. This means the individual becomes responsible not only for questioning old beliefs, but for cultivating new ones. Without moderation, the risk is either fanaticism, holding to outdated truths despite their collapse, or apathy, refusing to hold any values at all. But with moderation, one can move fluidly between questioning and affirming, doubting and committing, letting go and creating anew. This balance prevents the soul from being trapped by the rigidity of the past or the emptiness of despair. In this way, moderation does not reduce life to compromise, but enriches it with creativity. To revalue values is to treat life as an unfinished work of art, where each moment requires a decision, each experience adds color, and each loss creates space for a new form. Nihilism announces that there are no eternal meanings. Moderation responds that this is precisely why meaning can be made. The collapse of absolutes does not signal the end of value, but the possibility of values that are more honest, more human, and more alive. Strength is often imagined as something loud, aggressive, and absolute, as if power only appears in the form of domination, extremes, or grand gestures. Nietzsche himself often praised intensity, the overcoming of weakness through acts of will, the burning passion that drives the individual to rise above the herd. Yet hidden within his vision is another form of strength, quieter but no less powerful, the strength of balance. Moderation, wrongly dismissed as timidity, is in fact the subtle power that prevents collapse into either fanaticism or despair. To live moderately is not to live halfway, but to live steadily, and this steadiness is what resists the pull of nihilism more effectively than any violent outburst of will. Extremes seduce because they appear decisive. To throw oneself completely into a cause, a belief, or a denial feels intoxicating. There is no uncertainty in fanaticism. There is no hesitation in despair. But this decisiveness is brittle. The fanatic burns too brightly, consuming himself in the fire of his convictions, while the despairing nihilist extinguishes the flame altogether. Both collapse, one from too much heat, the other from none at all. Moderation, however, is endurance. It is the ability to carry the flame without letting it either consume or die, to sustain vitality across the long span of existence rather than in sudden bursts. This endurance is strength because it requires constant vigilance and adjustment. To live moderately means to resist the simplicity of absolutes and to hold oneself in the tension of contradictions. It demands patience, discipline, and the courage to live without guarantees. Anyone can surrender to extremes because extremes relieve one of the burden of choice. To balance between them, however, requires continuous effort, and in that effort lies real power. Moderation keeps the self intact even when the world around it shifts, because it does not depend on eternal truths or total negations, but on the active work of maintaining harmony. Nihilism thrives on collapse, and collapse comes most easily to what is rigid. A person who insists on eternal certainties will shatter when those certainties are questioned. A person who insists that nothing matters will be immobilized when faced with beauty, love, or responsibility that contradicts his denial. Moderation avoids this fragility. It bends without breaking, adapts without losing itself, and thus endures where others fall. Its strength is quiet but profound. It does not seek to dominate or destroy, but to persist, to remain vital in the face of emptiness. This kind of strength is not weakness disguised, but a deeper form of mastery. It is mastery over the self rather than over others, over one's impulses rather than over the world. The moderate individual does not flee into illusions, but neither does he drown in despair. He recognizes that life contains no final guarantees, and yet chooses to affirm it anyway, not with fanatic zeal, but with resilient steadiness. His moderation is not a lack of passion, but a shaping of passion, not the absence of will, but its refinement. Seen in this light, moderation becomes a hidden power, one that resists both the intoxication of excess and the suffocation of emptiness. It proves stronger than the extremes because it endures longer, adapts better, and creates more space for meaning to emerge. To live moderately is not to live small, but to live in such a way that life does not burn out or fade away. It is to walk steadily where others collapse, to hold fast where others lose themselves, and to continue creating where others surrender. This is why moderation, often underestimated, is in truth the strength that carries life beyond the grip of nihilism. In the end, nihilism is not an enemy to be crushed, but a shadow to be understood. Lucidity shows us the void, but it is moderation that teaches us how to live with it. To walk between extremes, to resist both blind faith and total despair, is not weakness but resilience. It is the quiet strength that allows us to create meaning even when no ultimate meaning is given. Life does not need absolutes to be worth living. It needs balance, courage, and the willingness to shape value in the face of nothingness. Escaping nihilism is not about escaping the truth, but about carrying it without being broken. And in that balance, in that moderation, lies a deeper, more enduring form of power.